Okay, cool. I will share my screen real quick. All righty. Can everyone see a presentation? Everything looks good?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All righty. So this week we're going to be talking about local, state, and federal advocacy and how to advocate from your home as well. And just like what advocacy, I mean, not just for climate change, but what advocacy looks like in general, which is what I'll get started with. So a lot of what I'm about to talk about, I got from this book called Winning the Green New Deal by the Sunrise Movement. And I highly recommend it. If you're in Columbia, I got it out of the Columbia Library. So it will soon be returned there for you to take out. But yeah, so that's where I got most of this info from my part of the presentation. So first I wanted to really quickly talk about the data cycle, which I didn't really think about until I read this book. But so if you want to imagine you work at this big company and that and you know that company invests in fossil fuels. And so you go to your bosses and you say, we should divest in fossil fuels and start investing in something else like renewable energy or what have you. And they say, show us the data of why we should do that. And then we'll do it. And then you try and do the studies and it takes years and years. And you go back to your bosses and they say, we need this data to make this decision. All of a sudden it's years later and the company still hasn't divested in fossil fuels and the cycle just continues over and over again. And so for something like the climate crisis, we have the data already and we have the proof of the changing world right in front of us. And so now we need kind of this people's advocacy. And we need to have some people power involved rather than just getting caught in this data cycle, which is really important, of course. Data is very important, but we also need people to kind of start advocating for this. And so the book kind of, they categorize the power of the people into these two buckets, kind of. And so there's the growing majority, which is a passive support for a cause that a person may designate on an online survey or by polling, essentially saying, yes, I believe in climate change and I think that we should do something about it. And then there is this growing base of active support, so emphasis on the active part. And so these are folks who continually take action over and over again through voting, protesting, non-cooperating, speaking out, or actively supporting the movement, which we'll talk about in a little while. And these two things together are how we really push advocacy and action against the climate crisis. And so a passive majority is really important and necessary. Movements can't really change laws without passive support of people. And so a durable passive majority doesn't guarantee victory, but victory usually cannot happen without it. And so let's take the ruling on same-sex marriage, for example. So President Obama refused to push the legislation of same-sex marriage forward until 2011, when polls found that a majority of Americans did support equal marriage rights. And then Obama announced his support. And so between 2010 and 2014 there, politician after politician changed their position on the issue because through the ballot box, the people were showing support. And so like it says here, lawmakers will rarely step out ahead of public sentiment because they're there because of the folks who voted for them. So why would they bring up an issue that maybe their constituents don't care about, even though doing so might be the right thing to do, but that's a whole other conversation for another time. But so now we'll talk in a second about how the durable majority also needs an active base for successful advocacy. And so in May 2019, 63% of Americans agreed that the Green New Deal was a good idea. But that polling data alone doesn't just magically overcome opposition. Just because this massive amount of people supported it doesn't mean that does anything. And so a difference between broad but quiet public support and millions of dollars in campaign money. So just because someone put on a poll that they believe in the Green New Deal, that doesn't mean that that a politician will just all of a sudden support it, especially when they're trying to choose between a massive amount of political campaign money over maybe what 63% of Americans believe in. And so, for example, a wealth tax. 75% of Americans want a wealth tax, but there are so many anti-tax lobbyists working against this that it's really hard to overcome, to kind of push a wealth tax through without an active base. And so again, passive support plus an active base, you can't just rely on passive support. And like I said before, that that change can't really happen without it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that change will happen just with passive support. And like I said before, there will always be lobbyists and huge amounts of campaign money. Like in this graphic here, it says 2 out of 3 people disapprove of the job Congress is doing. Who is the third person? And then lobbyists here saying beats me, which is which kind of goes to show how much power that lobbyists have in our government. And so I really liked this quote by Theda Skocpol, and she says, to counter fierce political opposition, reformers will have to build organizational networks across the country, and they will need to orchestrate sustained political efforts that stretch far beyond friendly congressional offices, comfy boardrooms, and posh retreats. And then this quote by David Roberts as well. So poll results do not attend town halls or write members of Congress or exhort their fellow citizens through, excuse me, ideological media. Constituencies do that. And so that's what we're really talking about with an active base, is that you have to, and not just be an active base, but be consistently active over and over and over again, which can get really tiring and really deflating and kind of hopeless, but really pushing through that for change. And so the book also mentions about how many people do we need to kind of put into context, like how big of a group of people we actually need as an active base to maybe make change. And so I looked at a bunch of historical, I don't want to say revolutions necessarily, but like movements and stuff, and kind of got the data that shows us that nonviolent campaigns with 3.5% of the population had success in making change in our country. And so 3.5% of the population right now is 11 million people in the US. And like I said, again, engaged persistently. So active and sustained engagement, not just maybe writing your senator or representative once, but consistently writing them and having a large group of people consistently writing them, which Nikki will cover in a little while here. And so nonviolent campaigns include things like boycotts, marches, strikes, civil disobedience, and campaigns. And I just really like this quote by Howard Zinn saying that protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy. It is absolutely essential to it. And so our fight is offensive and defensive when it comes to the Green New Deal. And so we may block one bill and then pass more and take steps forward and maybe take a few steps backwards. But we need to make the climate crisis and the Green New Deal urgent. And so we can't just depend on these weather events and worsening storms and fires and floods and pandemics. We have to kind of make politicians choose between this moral crisis or backing a system that we know that is not working. And so, like I mentioned, a national moral crisis. So movements make visible the injustices of violence, inequality, and oppression that power holders have long suppressed and perpetuated. So we saw it a lot in the civil rights movement, and it's already been panned in this way. Of environmental racism has come to light a lot in the last few years, and that's something that the Sunrise Movement works a lot on. Is not just the climate crisis, but the injustices of the climate crisis as well. And so a big part of this as well is to stop blaming things that aren't actually the problem and bring to light the true causes of the climate crisis. And so it isn't waste, like it says in this graphic here, or isn't marine litter. I mean, that is a problem, but it's the production to begin with. It's the system to begin with. It's not just too many gas guzzling cars on the road. It's the way cities are designed, like Nikki talked about last week with Complete Streets. And so people, and like another example with environmental racism, it's not people who quote unquote live in slums. They don't want to live that way. They're strategically and systematically ignored, making their neighborhoods less prosperous than white or affluent ones. And like I said, bring to light environmental racism, which, like I said, the Sunrise Movement and I mean, a lot of environmental organizations are trying to do now. And so now the big thing with the Green New Deal advocacy and climate change advocacy is challenging the fossil fuel CEOs with mass non-cooperation. And so I don't know how many of you have seen A Bug's Life, but So when you think about challenging fossil fuel CEOs and lobbyists, A Bug's Life is a really good example. And so Hopper, who's this scary looking grasshopper right here, he's the grasshopper's gang leader essentially, and he controls a colony of ants and worries that then a lone bug standing up to him could be a threat to the grasshopper rule. And so to demonstrate, he throws like one tiny piece of grain on one of his little members and asks if it hurts, and he laughs, and so he throws another one, and then he laughs again, and then he pours the entire container of grain on him, and burying him, and says this quote, "You let one ant stand up to us and then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. If they figure that out, there goes our way of life." And so that's kind of our fight against challenging fossil fuel CEOs. Is really similar to that, kind of challenging this huge way of life that a few people benefit from, and kind of educating people, and that if we all stand up against it, it can really change. And so, like I said, just going a little bit forward on mass non-cooperation. So the economy, government, and society depends us all to keep the status quo humming, to go to work, to go to school, to pay taxes, to pick up trash, to take out your trash, to recycle. And mass non-cooperation is really not easy. And it's definitely a final tactic, but it's an organized, massive group of people and structural power. And like I said before, we saw mass non-cooperation happen in like the civil rights movement with the bus boycott and things like that. And so in 2013, 1 in 4 Americans supported organizing in nonviolent civil disobedience against corporate or government activities that make global warming worse. And that was in 2013. I mean, that's almost 10 years ago now. And 1 in 8 in 2013 said they would personally engage in such activities, which is a huge deal, to kind of commit yourself to being vulnerable in like a protest or a march, or not cooperating in something. I mean, those are all kind of hard things for people to do. And so on that, it's just time to start organizing, because if 2013, that was just a statistic, imagine what it is today and how we really need to capitalize on advocating. And really, we know we kind of have that passive support, but now it's time to really get active and to persistently stay active. And I forgot to mention this before, but like even with this presidency, a big worry is that everyone will kind of get complacent because we've passed these 4 years of just going backwards. And that's not necessarily the case. Like I know at PeaceWorks, we've talked about like, yeah, we'll support the administration or the political climate when it's working for us, but then we also still have to go against it when it's not working for us. And to definitely keep that part in mind is really important. All right.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, that was a great first half. So now I'm going to take all of that information and help give you some information about how you can be an advocate, and whether you're advocating for the Green New Deal or just climate action and environmental justice in general. These will just be some good tips that you can take home with you to help spark some action. Next slide, please. So the best first step that you can take in any situation is educating yourself. And the great thing about this is it can be done whether or not you're in a pandemic, thank you to the internet. So I recommend reading books and articles from diverse perspective on whatever topic you're interested in. Podcasts, TED Talks, and audiobooks are also really great as well. I know I live a bit of a busier lifestyle nowadays, so audiobooks and podcasts are a really great avenue to keep learning, even when you kind of have a busy schedule and can't sit down and read quite as much. Also, it's important to think locally and research how the climate crisis is affecting your community, and that can also kind of serve as a motivation for you and others to get involved. And it's just important to remember that learning is a dynamic process. There's never a point that you reach where you know everything and then there's nothing else to learn. There's always new things coming in, so there's always something more to learn. So make sure that once you think you're well educated on a topic, don't stop there. You want to keep going. So next slide. The next, for some reason, the slides are out of order again. Oh, well, that's fine. We'll roll with it. So another thing that you can do is engage your elected officials. And this can be done by email, writing a letter, a phone call, all of which can be done from home, which is great. You know, contacting your elected officials is really great for changing environmental policy, which is key for making meaningful and lasting change. And it also lets the officials know what the public wants. They're there to serve the public. They are public servants. So you want to make sure that you let them know what it is that the community that they're serving is wanting. And I have these links, which I can put in the chat. It's a way you can find out who your elected officials are. I just put these states based on our past audience. But if you're not from one of these 3 states, you can easily just Google your state name. So Illinois legislator lookup. And usually within the first few search results, it's pretty easy to find based on your address. So I just put those in the chat. You can move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk a bit more about engaging your elected officials, because I know, at least for me at first, this really seemed like a daunting process. So I just wanted to give some tips and tricks on how to do this effectively. So the first thing that you want to do before contacting anyone is researching your district or your state. So asking yourself questions like, how is my state impacted, and how can the clean energy economy benefit my district or state? A good resource is the E2 job reports, which again, I will put the link in the chat. And then you also want to know what the public opinion is in your neighborhood. Again, like I said, when you're contacting elected officials, you're contacting public servants. So you want to have a good idea of what your community wants. And this website is a good way that you can figure that out. And then you'll also want to research the actual person that you will be contacting. So what is their story? What committees are they on? What issues do they care about? And what industries donate to that person or that person's campaign? And then again, I'll put this link in the chat. This is just a good website that you can go to kind of figure out who is supporting what financially. So that way you just kind of have that background information going into those conversations. Next slide. So some good general tips that anyone who wants to contact an elected official should keep in mind is letting them know that you're a constituent in their district. Constituents almost always get priority when you contact an elected official, just because you are particularly the person that they're serving. So it's just a good thing to let them know. And also you want to state the reason that you're writing or calling in the first place, just because they're super busy. They always have a ton of stuff on their plate and you don't want to waste their time. So letting them know right off the bat is really great. Also, there's a lot of good organizations out there that offer those like pre-written email templates where you just kind of plug in your name and your contact information and it will send it for you. You don't have to write any actual message. And if it's that or no contact at all, I think they're a great option. However, I do think that personalized emails and letters and phone calls are more effective. But again, even the smallest action is still action nonetheless. So just do whatever is most comfortable for you. And then you also want your messages to be clear and concise. Again, they have a lot on their plate. You don't want to waste their time. You want to get your message across pretty quickly. And then it never hurts to compliment their accomplishments. You don't want to contact an elected official and ask for change while slamming their past actions. It's just not really effective for any human being, in my opinion. So it doesn't hurt to throw a compliment in there if you can. And then personal stories also kind of help cut through the noise. So if you have any sort of personal anecdote that you can throw in there to kind of humanize you and your message, that's always really helpful. And I wanted to throw in this quote just because I think it's a really good takeaway from contacting any elected official. Keep it simple, keep it short, and keep it focused. Next slide. So kind of along the similar note of contacting your elected officials is testifying at a public legislative hearing. There's a really great quote out there that says legislation is decided by those people who show up. And it's unfortunately very true. So if you ever have the opportunity to do this, I recommend it. And just like engaging elected officials, you want to keep things simple and straightforward. You want to stick with what you know. Again, personal stories are always a powerful addition to your testimony. But anything that's outside of a personal story, you want to make sure you confine it to remarks that are irrefutable facts and things within your expertise. That's just in your best interest. And then preparation is always key. So I always recommend signing up to receive notes about the bill or updates from the committee hearing the bill or whatever issue that you're wanting to testify on. And then making sure you're reading any of those texts really thoroughly. But knowledge is power, in my opinion, and the more you know, the more you can be prepared, and the more confidence that you can have when you're giving that testimony. Drafting it and then submitting it ahead of time is always great. And you also want to look at the guidelines ahead of time to make sure what you need to do ahead of time, again, just so you're prepared. And then also always practicing an oral presentation is really helpful as well. So I would like to say that this could easily be done from home in a pandemic. However, at least in Missouri, that is not really the case. There's no mask mandate in the Capitol, and there's limited to pretty much non-existent access to remote testimony. But I wanted to include this little snapshot of lovely Rudy Giuliani remotely testifying to a Missouri committee condemning the 2020 election results. If you ask me if he can tune in remotely to Missouri legislative hearings and committee meetings, then I think the people should be able to as well. Again, right now that's not really the case, but hopefully we'll see some improvements in the future. Next slide. So again, going back to, elected officials are very busy people. You don't want to waste their time. You want to get your message off. You want to get your message out pretty clearly and concisely. So I always like to recommend this elevator pitch. It's a good way that you can state who you are and what you care about in just 30 seconds to a minute. So for example, my name is Nikki. I'm a trained climate reality leader and a Master of Social Work candidate from Manchester, Missouri. I'm passionate about the climate crisis because my partner has asthma and my dad has COPD, and the air quality literally determines their ability to go outside each day. I'm here to ask you to make a commitment to prioritizing climate action, justice, and jobs. And I strongly encourage you to vote no on Senate Bill 230 or House Bill 488 to allow communities to make their own decisions about clean energy. So if you can save this little pitch, I recommend. It's just a good way, like I said, to let them know who you are, what you're asking for, and what you're interested in and why. Next slide. Okay, this is where the slides are out of order again. So let me just find this, my notes.
Do you want me to go to a different slide, Nikki? Are you okay?
No, this is perfect. So another way that you can get involved and take action is voting and encouraging others to do so. As we've learned in the past 5 years or so, elections have consequences, and not voting is equivalent to giving up your voice. And it's just an opportunity to make change in your community. And voting processes have been expanded, to allow for absentee voting. However, there's still a lot of work to be done against voter suppression. So hopefully we'll see that improve as the years go by. Next slide. Okay, they should all be in order from here on out, so that's good. So other actions that you can take from your home or in person really is writing or engaging social media posts. In today's society, that's just a really great way to get the word out to a lot of people really quickly and in a safe way because you're not leaving your house. So even liking a post about pro-environmental topics helps spread that information. So even if you don't feel comfortable making a post on your own or sharing something, even just liking and commenting on it can help boost that post so more people see it. Volunteering with key organizations is always helpful as well. And next week, we'll be talking about some good key organizations that you can get involved with. So stay tuned for that. And volunteering can be done remotely. A lot of organizations are developing ways to do this. Like, for example, Eric and I are doing that right now. And then if you're able to make monetary donations to these organizations or campaigns that support environmental action, I recommend it. But if you're not able to, as I've discussed, there's a lot of other ways that you can get involved. And then one of the most powerful things that I think you can do is just simply talking about the things that matter to you, whether it's to your friends or to your family or just to the peers around you. I have learned, based on what people have told me, is that you never really know how, like, when or how you can inspire someone just by simply talking about the things that you're interested in. So, for example, with my friends in my social work program, I have apparently inspired a lot of them because I talk about the need for incorporating environmental topics into social work curriculum. And I was just talking about that because I thought it was true and I wasn't necessarily trying to inspire others. But that was just kind of an unattended consequence that happened. So I've learned that regardless of what you want the outcome to be, I think it's important to talk about things that matter to you just because it can kind of spark a domino effect. Next slide. So kind of speaking about these climate conversations and talking with other people, you always want to make sure that these conversations are productive. And I know that engaging in conversations like this that have a lot of political undertones, they need to be approached carefully and strategically. So I wanted to give some tips on how to do that. So before you have any sort of climate conversation that's focused on change, it's always important to think about what goals you want to achieve in this conversation. So why are you engaging in this conversation in the first place? What do you want whoever it is that you're talking to do after this conversation? And you also want to think about who your audience is. What are their values? What issues matter to them? What goals do you have in common? And how do they feel about these topics that you're talking about? In my opinion, the more informed you are about your audience's beliefs, the more you can cater what you say to best align with their values. And you also want to ask yourself, what conversations are already taking place in the audience members' community, so that you can kind of go off of that. So in my opinion, there are about 3 different kinds of audiences that you could have. They're either alarmed or concerned about climate change. And for those types of people, I recommend providing information on feasible and effective solutions and also promoting personal leadership. If they're more cautious or disengaged, I recommend providing easily consumed information from reputable sources, as well as just engaging in personalized conversations and using a lot of those personal narratives and kind of climate stories that I talked about earlier. And then if they're doubtful and dismissive, I would take an indirect approach. So maybe instead of mentioning climate change at all, you could focus on the public health aspects or extreme weather, because you don't want to threaten their values, because then the conversation won't be productive. So again, just making sure you're keeping in mind of who your audience is so that you can cater the conversation to make it as productive as possible. Next slide. And then, like I talked about with testifying, you want to make sure that you're as prepared as possible so that you know what to expect and you can feel confident about the conversation that's about to be had. So with message development, you want to think about what are your main ideas or concepts that you want to use to guide this conversation. And it helps to focus on the benefits of taking action and speaking to the audience's values rather than challenging them. And then again, adding a personal narrative, telling your own climate story is always really helpful, just because it makes you relatable and it helps the audience connect to what you're saying. And then interaction and logistics, what kind of conversation do you want to have? Do you want to educate the audience on something? Do you want to encourage them to do something? And if so, what? And then when and where would whoever it is that you're talking to be most comfortable to have this conversation? These are just some really good things to keep in mind, again, so that you're as prepared as possible. And then an important thing to keep in mind is evaluation. So before you go into this conversation, think about, what does success look like? If this were to go exactly how you wanted it to, what would that look like and what would happen after the fact? And then taking that idea of success and thinking about how you're going to measure that and then what you're going to do with that information. So if something doesn't go quite as planned in your conversation or something doesn't go well, you want to think about why that happened, so that you can use that information in the future to make sure it doesn't happen again. Alrighty, next slide. So now we are going to talk about specific policies to follow at the local, state, and federal level. So I have some already identified ones, but Ashton, if there are any that I don't list, or if there's anything that you want to touch on, like I think on the next slide, I would love it if you could talk about it a bit more. Feel free to do so. So now we can go to the next slide. So the Sierra Club has this initiative called Mayors for 100% Clean Energy. Ashton, if you want to talk a little bit briefly about that, that would be great. Not to throw you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy to talk about this. I do this all the time. So hi everyone, I'm Ashton. I am an organizer for the Sierra Club. Nikki and I both met through talking about social work and the environment, and we really clicked. So happy to be here. I'm based in St. Louis for reference, so some of my examples I may use may be St. Louis based, but I'm pretty sure most of these examples and whatnot I discussed may be covered across the state. We'll see. So yeah, our Mayors for 100% Clean Energy is a local strategy that we're using to engage local level decision makers about climate issues. So how many of y'all have been in Missouri the past, or have lived in Missouri, let's say the past 5 years? Been in Missouri the past 5 years or so? Okay, a handful of us. All right, well, the makeup of the Missouri government specifically right now is very one-sided. We have a supermajority in the House there, so that means 70% of our legislators are Republicans and 30% are Democrats, and that means one party can really push through any policy they want. And unfortunately, right now, the supermajority in down in Jefferson City, they are not prioritizing climate change. They're not prioritizing the climate crisis. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. They are often in the pockets of corporate polluters and other entities. So not very great. So we use this Mayors for Clean Energy process to really, for multiple reasons, honestly. So one, we're having one-to-one conversations with folks already in our communities. So we're talking to our neighbors and our friends, kind of like what Nikki touched on, right? You know, telling our stories about why this issue matters to us. And then we're going to someone right down the road, someone in our backyard, our mayor. For some folks, that can be a really personable person, or someone you can easily get in contact with. But so we use this strategy to, one, build power within communities, have people talking about the climate issues, and start giving power. And then two, actually sitting down with a local decision maker and lobbying for this. But this type of lobbying is a little different. It's not for a bill or a legislation, let's say. This this part of our strategy, Mayors for Clean Energy, is a pledge for mayors to sign on to that says, I would like to, for my municipality to eventually be 100%, fueled by 100% clean and renewable energy by 2035, I believe the year is we have. But by signing that pledge, it kind of sounds like, oh, woo, a pledge. What does that really mean? Our pledge, we've been able to argue with some lawyers in the Missouri Public Service Commission to take these pledges into account when our utilities here in Missouri, so eastern part of the state, Ameren, saying, hey, these communities in your territory want clean and renewable energy. The mayors have signed this pledge. this is going to happen. You have to adjust your energy consumption to match these goals. So that's a really powerful way we can start transitioning and moving that power, and it's just simple by just reaching out to a mayor and seeing if they can sign on. And that document holds legal weight to start pushing utilities because, unfortunately, the fact here in Missouri is our utilities have a lot of power, considering that they're investor owned. So they need to hear from us how we want our energy to become, how we want it sourced. So that is one strategy we are working. We recently just had the newest mayor of Kansas City, Quentin Lucas, sign on 2 weeks ago. We were about to announce it, but he's kind of poking around whether or not he wants to run for US Senate. So we will see if he will actually announce it soon, but we're really excited. There's still momentum around this, but we also have a twin to this program called Ready for 100, which is the backbone of it. So, okay, we made this pledge. What is the legislation looking like at the local level? So we have a lot of different ways to engage our folks. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like me to touch on, Nikki.
That was perfect. Thank you for giving that breakdown.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's always great to start at the local level, and this campaign or this initiative is actually a national Sierra Club initiative. So even if you're not in Missouri, I still recommend looking into it and seeing what can be done in your community to take action. So thank you again, Ashton, for touching on that. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to get into some state level policies or bills. And again, this is all for Missouri. So if you're not from here, I apologize. But I think it's still important to be informed. So I wanted to talk about Senate Bill 230 and House Bill 488, which I briefly mentioned in my little elevator pitch example. So this legislation prohibits political subdivisions from prohibiting the connection or reconnection of a utility service based on the type or source of the energy. So basically, it prohibits municipalities and counties from being able to make their own decisions about clean energy. And it's kind of part of the Missouri legislation trend that tells local governments that they can't protect their environment or make decisions for themselves. So we want to recommend that Missouri politicians oppose these bills. The next one is Senate Bill 178 and House Bill 539, which modifies provisions relating to net metering. So net metering, it keeps track of how much, like say you have solar panels, it keeps track of how much solar you produce or what you produce and what you use. And it kind of allows for credits to be given when more energy is produced than consumed. So it's basically an attack on solar by modifying it in the way that these bills describe. And then House Bill 527, it modifies provisions to eminent domain for utility purposes. So eminent domain is the right of a government to use private property for public use with compensation to that property owner. And this bill was designed to stop the Grain Belt Express transmission line, which would bring clean, inexpensive wind energy from Southwest Kansas to Missouri. And it wants to prevent the use of eminent domain for this specific project, but it would allow for utilities like Ameren, Evergy, Empire, et cetera, to continue the use of eminent domain. So it's really putting an unfair advantage with the fossil fuel industry, which just isn't fair and doesn't really make any sense. And then it's also important to keep in mind that wind energy is a lot cheaper than coal. And the Green Belt Express would create so many jobs in Missouri. So it would create tons of construction jobs in Kansas City and manufacturing jobs out of Centralia. And then HJR 55, which is House Joint Resolution 55, it's wanting to change the Missouri Constitution, specifically the section that created the Conservation Commission and the Missouri Department of Conservation in a very unfair way. So for more background information, the commission currently has 4 members appointed by the governor, and you can't appoint more than 2 people of the same political party. So it allows for a commission that is nonpartisan, it's independent, it's funded by citizens, and it's driven by science rather than politics. But they are proposing a 9-member commission that would have 1 person from each region of the state. And this would put politicians in charge of the candidates for the commission, and it eliminates that non-political nature of the Conservation Commission, which is actually, Missouri is one of the first states to do this. So a lot of states are in envy of Missouri because of this commission, and so we don't want to change it. And it would basically just make the commission more responsive to legislators than to what Missourians want or need, which just isn't great. And I also wanted to point out that this bill advanced out of a 13-member Missouri House Conservation and Natural Resources Committee, but it was only after the House Speaker added 8 more members to that committee in order to get the results that he needed to get this to pass. So not cool. Next slide, please. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was voter suppression. I touched on that a little bit briefly earlier on, but so many Missouri legislators are trying to push false claims of voter fraud, and these bills would make it a lot harder for, for low-income individuals, for communities of color, for Indigenous peoples, for members of the LGBTQ community, students, and young people. It would make it a lot harder for them to register to vote in the state of Missouri, which just isn't fair. And a lot of what they want to do is require photo IDs for voting, and there just isn't really a need for that. There hasn't been any what's the word I'm looking for? Any decent claims saying that that's necessary. And like I said, it just kind of causes voter suppression. And then the other bills that I want to briefly mention talk about rollbacks on petitioning and citizen ballot measures. So this attacks the initiative petition process. So you would collect signatures in order to get a piece of legislation to be put on our ballot so that the people could vote on it. And it's just one way that a person can participate in our democracy. And our state thinks it's too easy of a process currently, and they want to increase the number of signatures needed while also imposing additional requirements that would really make it so only multi-million-dollar campaigns can file these petitions. So currently, Ashton, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure they want currently 150,000 good or valid signatures, and they want to significantly increase this. HJR 22 wants to make it so 12% of legal voters in every congressional district have to sign these petitions. HJR 20 wants to make it at least 10% of voters in every congressional district. And then the remaining ones want to make it so you have to get signatures in every county in the state. And so it's just making it a lot more difficult than it needs to be. And they're making it sound like the current process is easy, which if you've ever participated in any sort of campaign where you need signatures to get something on the ballot, such as Medicaid expansion, you'll know it's a very difficult process and it doesn't need to be made any harder than it is. So I just wanted to highlight that really quick. Next slide, please. So the last thing that I want to talk about is a federal policy, HR 1. It's for the People Act, and it talks about voting rights reform. It wants to expand voting access and restore voting rights. So it would create a nationwide automatic voter registration system that would allow for same-day voter registration, and it would expand the ways in which people can vote. It wants to protect elections by safeguarding infrastructure from hostile actors. It wants to strengthen ethics laws. So it wants to curb the influence of corporate polluters by requiring the president to disclose their tax returns. And it puts together restrictions on lobbying, and it prevents elected officials from spending taxpayer money to settle sexual harassment lawsuits. It wants to fix our broken campaign finance system by empowering small dollar donors, supporting small dollar public financing of elections, and combating the influence of dark money unleashed by Citizens United. And then lastly, it wants to allow people to pick their elected officials rather than having politicians pick their voters. So you think, especially in Missouri, gerrymandering. They want to ban partisan gerrymandering and increase protections for communities of color, just making it more fair for all. So just wanted to highlight that really quick. You can go to the next slide. That's really all we had to cover. So we'll get into questions after I just mentioned this really quick. Like I said earlier, next week, we're going to be talking about key organizations to follow, and it will be our last session of this 4-week series. So make sure you join and bring a friend if you can. It will be next Wednesday at this time, 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central Time on the 31st. We will have a ton of guest speakers, including Ashton, to represent Sierra Club. We'll have people from Most Policy Initiative and the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network. We'll have someone from Sustain Mizzou. I think we might have someone from Sunrise Movement, and probably more people that I'm forgetting to mention right now. But make sure you come and you'll learn about some great organizations, both local to Missouri and nationally as well. Now you can go to the next slide, which is for questions or comments or concerns or compliments. So let's engage in discussion.
Awesome. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so we can see each other. Cool.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Dang,
you.
you killed those policy descriptions.
Thank you. I learned most of them from Ashton, so it goes to her.
I learned most of them from like a lot of other people. So we all learn from each other. That's what it's all
Yeah.
about.
Yes. It's all about having those climate conversations, everyone.
Great.
Well, I thought this was an excellent presentation tonight. I really appreciate the effort put into it and the presentation.
Thanks, Mark.
I have to admit that I have a sense of deep-seated frustration around the difficulty of making the kinds of changes that are so obviously sorely needed. And as somebody who's been involved in climate activism for decades now, I've seen so little progress, and the people who are currently in office on the state level and the people who are representing us in Washington at the federal level are so opposed to anything reasonable that it becomes a very frustrating process. I've seen a few really positive things that have happened. One of them is that we passed a renewable energy portfolio standard for Columbia by initiative petition in 2004. And we followed that by a statewide initiative petition effort in 2008 that Renew Missouri headed up, and that ended up being a strong victory statewide. Columbia City Council has embraced a stronger renewable energy standard. The state hasn't. And Columbia City Council has enacted a climate action and adaptation plan, which is real positive. So there have been some positive things that have happened, but right now, when I think about contacting Vicki Hartzler, Roy Blunt, or Josh Hawley, I can do it again. I've done it so many times, but it's like talking to that wall over there. It doesn't talk back, and it doesn't change. It's still that wall over there, and I'm fearful that Columbia City Council might turn in the wrong direction on April 6th. We've got a couple of people running for office who are decent in the 2 wards that are up for grabs, but we also have people who are running who are awful, and they have a lot of money from the development community. And if they get into office, one of them wants to dismantle the climate action adaptation plan completely. The others are less upfront about that, but again, would not support the kinds of positive changes we need to actually implement the cap. All of this brings me around to where we started tonight with Erica talking about possibilities for other strategies or tactics beyond simply talking to legislators and hoping they do the right thing. And some of those are appealing, but it's hard to know where the leverage points are. You know, who do you commit civil disobedience? Where do you commit civil disobedience that actually affects climate change? You know, if they were building a big fossil fuel facility here in town, a power generating station or some other, you know, transfer station for fuel or something like that, you could do a sit-in blockading the entrance to that facility. But you know, what's our pressure points here? That I'd be curious what people think about that, because I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I'm having a hard time coming up with. I mean, we have an annual Walk for the Climate as a visibility event. This past year, we did a Walk for the Climate and a Bike for the Climate event. Those are good visibility events. We've turned out people for city council hearings, but really in terms of upping the ante and getting more consistent opportunities for active participation, which is really what we need. You were talking in the beginning about having an actively engaged core of people who are, you know, a small percentage of the overall population, but still nationally millions of people. Well, where do those people plug in on a day in, day out basis? And that's one of the things I think we need to be thinking about and talking about.
Can I just hop in there really quickly and say, Mark, it's funny you say like the direct action in front of utilities and whatnot. The Missouri legislature, one, has repeatedly tried to make that a felony here in Missouri. And anyone associated with like an organization could be fired, and crazy the stuff they're trying to do. And this is only for utilities, you know, not for other stuff. And also there's another bill pending in Missouri that would make it legal for folks to run over protesters in the street. So, you know, there's direct action is so needed, and the decision makers, you know, they're recognizing like its potential with it.
Yeah.
And that's why they're trying to suppress it. So yeah.
I want to thank you guys, Erica and Nikki and Ashton, for the presentation. This is my third one. Only the second time I've opened my mouth, but I am engaged. And I have an observation. It might be too broad to do anything about or with, but I'll put it out there. Early in the presentation, there was a slide that had positive support plus active base equals, and I filled in the equals critical mass. And then you have a name for passive support and active base. There is a body of people who we have seen all over issues like this and politics in general, people who support and vote and advocate against their own best interest. And all of the advocacy for destructive climate policies and other policies are against people's best interest. And does that offer a leverage point, such as Mark mentioned? And how would it be exploited? Well, I mean, there are people who don't know they're acting or advocating against their own best interests. There are people who know very well that they are, and I imagine they might need to be approached differently. I imagine them in another later slide in that list of audiences. And I just wonder if there's opportunity there.
I think there's definitely opportunity, but yeah, that one's definitely a slippery slope to, yeah, Ashton, you're right about the self-interest thing. That's, yeah, it's pretty shocking how many people vote against themselves with issues, not even climate change, just like across the board. Yeah, but you're right, and broaching those conversations is really hard, especially with people who don't necessarily trust the government and what they have or have not done for them in the past. And so then why should they vote for something that might give the government more power, but more power to do good? And yeah, that is
You guys have done such a good job of listing things and suggesting particular actions in a particular situation, and who might respond to this kind of thing, who might respond to the other. I'm just wondering if there isn't a roadmap for these people.
Well, I think Nikki's like kind of breakdown of who you're talking to is really important. And like I think you mentioned, Nikki, but also just in my own research about how to talk to people about climate change or politics in general, is just bringing it down to their level and their values. Not their level, that sounds like demeaning, but I don't mean it in that way, but like bringing it down to their values. And like, what do they value? Like the fact that they can't get to a hospital, or that they can't like X, Y, and Z. I think that is the most important part is, and I think you mentioned, Nikki, like not even talking about climate change, but just like kind of trying to make the point of, do you not have access to this, or are you suffering from this? Then why wouldn't you support, or not why wouldn't you, it's also not a great phrase to use, but then you should support this. But
yeah, those conversations can definitely be tricky because language is such a powerful tool that can sometimes be used against you. So that's why I think it's important to really know your audience so that you can cater the language that you use to best align with their values and what they want to hear in order to get the message that you want across, to see the action that you want to see.
Yeah. There was one other, this is a brief question. When you spoke about Senate Bill 230 and House Bill 488, the way it's worded, prohibiting the prohibition, which means it's permitting. And I just wonder if the bills are actually written that way, because very often, because it's either better in some circumstances, you get more people to vote for something, then you word it in such a way that you vote yes. And if it's better to get people to vote against it, if you have a better shot at mustering opposition, then you word it in such a way that you vote no in order to vote yes. And I'm just wondering if that prohibiting the prohibition of is part of the way the bill is worded.
Yeah, that was copy and pasted from the bill.
1000%.
It is, it's intentional manipulation.
Oh,
they want to make it as confusing as possible so that people don't have the ability to actually vote for what they would like to see. They just get confused and just vote based on what they think is the right thing, based on the confusing language that's on the bill.
Is it worth pointing that out and beating that drum in that particular case, in that, Well,
in this case, what you're dealing with is not something the voters are going to vote on. This is legislation. It's not something that's going to the voters. And it really is prohibiting a prohibition, actually. Right now, municipal officials, city councils and whatnot could potentially pass ordinances that say that we can't buy any electricity for Columbia, let's say, that's produced by coal power. And right now, we have the ability to do that. And our climate action and adaptation plan calls for getting to zero carbon-based electric generation by 2035. If this law passes and it gets challenged and is upheld, we're in a situation where Columbia City Council can no longer prohibit purchase of coal-based electricity. So that's what that bill is, and it is a prohibition of a prohibition.
okay.
And like, but they have, even though that's not something that people can vote on, they have done that before, making I mean, probably countless times, but just in the times that I've lived in Missouri, have made ballot measures extraordinarily confusing and manipulative so that people vote the way that legislators want them to vote. And therefore they pass this thing where if someone really thought about it, they'd be like, oh, I didn't mean to do that, but the way it's stated, I voted just that way, which is very disappointing that it has come to that point of manipulating people through through the way things are written on a ballot. But and also, like, if you think about like, I know at my full-time job for PedNet, we have considered making like our applications and surveys and whatnot down to like I think it's like an average 5th grade reading level, because you never know who's filling out that survey. You never know who's filling out a ballot. Why would you make something so technically complicated that someone, like, even with a college degree, has no idea what it means? And that's definitely worth bringing up and talking about.
Thanks.
Yeah, we've had a long history in Missouri of ballot titles and ballot descriptions being not just confusing, but actually, what should I say, false. You know, basically, I worked on a statewide ballot initiative campaign in 1984 called the Electric Ratepayer Protection Act. And we put a ballot measure on the state ballot that would have, if passed, prohibit utilities from passing on a bunch of different costs that were not legitimate costs, and would have saved ratepayers millions upon millions of dollars, and also prevented the Cowboy nuclear plant from being operated, which would have also been a great boon to us in terms of many things. But what ended up happening was the utilities had the ear of John Ashcroft, who at that point was our Attorney General, and got him to write the ballot title. In those days, they were the ones who did that, and ballot description. We went to court over it, but we lost in court, and it went to the voters with a really deceptive ballot title, and we lost big time. It was in part due to the ballot title. It was in part due to the $5 million they spent on advertising in 1984, which at that point was the most expensive ballot issue campaign ever in Missouri history. Since then, there have been others that have been bigger, but it was very frustrating.
Yeah, to say the least. Did you want to say something, Noah?
Oh, I do have a question for
Okay.
Ashton. You were talking about the mayors for clean energy thing. So if the mayor is in their current term and then they are out of power, is the Mayors for Clean Energy Act still able to be enforced? Like, you said something about 2035.
Yeah, so technically it's still in place, yes. We have often had times where we've had one mayor sign it, and then a new mayor come in and then actively be like, no, we're not committing to this, so they can rescind it at any time. That's happened in some rural parts of Missouri and whatnot. But yeah, with more administrations coming in, we're always still bringing this up too, especially with municipal elections going on right now, just so we can keep the conversation going, and still, building those relationships with our local decision makers. Specifically, this legislative session with so many attacks towards clean energy and our future for clean energy, having these relationships with local mayors, local county executives and whatnot have been really helpful, because we tell them what's happening, what this bill can do, and actually break it down. And then they're calling their legislators in the area or other senators, what have you, like, hey, I'm a mayor. I am a government official just like you, and you should put my community's accounts into your decision. So it's a great way to really build leverage too.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for asking, Noah.
Yeah, that was a good question, Noah. I didn't even think about that.
I might make some comment and a question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning a lot, and I really appreciate all the input today, especially about the legislation that I didn't know about. But there's a lot I don't know about. I was a Methodist pastor for 40 years, and stewardship was definitely a part of my ministry. I read a sermon I did in 1974 and was pretty impressed the other day that our church was kind of in line back then working. And then I retired and worked for medical college in India for 7 years. My wife got sick. I retired from that in order to be a caregiver for her. But when she died last year, I looked around for what I'm going to do next. And I don't know how it came about, but Citizens Climate Lobby came across my desk and they met every month. So I thought, I'd go there. So I did. And then I took Erica's class earlier, which was absolutely excellent. And I've used some of that material. I even referred to it last week, something that I got out of it. But I noticed, being new, I didn't know there was such a diversity of organizations and opinions and policies and way of going about it. And so I hadn't heard much about climate lobby from Peaceworks. And so I just, I wrote to Mark and just asked him if he could provide me with some kind of literature I could read as a critique of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And he took the time, didn't send me to read something. He took the time and read a really good explanation. Since then, I've discovered that the United Methodist Church has an organization that meets all the time. It does support, or at least mention, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. But then I found out that the United Methodist wouldn't. I was asked to do a program on climate for our United Methodist Women's group here, and through that meeting, I found out that they're having a series every week for 4 sessions, a study on, and it's called Climate Justice for All, and they're not mentioning the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So I'm learning a lot, and I'll be interested in the organizations next week that are mentioned. I guess my question is, in the last Congress, was there any legislation, climate legislation, that we actively supported through Peaceworks, or is that how it works?
I don't think Peaceworks actually lobbied for any particular legislation. There is some stuff that came out in the bill that passed at the very end of the 2020 year in December, the one that had the $600 dividend. They extended solar and wind tax credits, which is a really good thing, and it's good that passed. It was part of that whole package they put together. I haven't really looked all that closely at what was passed. Maybe somebody else knows more than I do about it, but I didn't even realize it was included in there, to be honest, until after the fact and after I read it. Anybody else know more about that?
I just want to clarify, are you asking at a federal level or a state level, Max?
I didn't mention it. I was thinking about federal level.
Federal level, okay. Yeah, there's different aspects of it, like the Green New Deal is like a overarching like policy vision. So there's bits and pieces moving, but I'm not sure if there's, a really overarching piece of policy moving just quite yet. Hopefully further into this administration, some stuff can happen. From my view, I don't know if other folks have insight.
What Biden ran on is something that's pretty solid compared to anything a Democratic nominee had run on before. It envisions spending a lot more money over a number of years and having a lot of restrictions on fossil fuel development and use. so far, they've not submitted, as far as I know, legislation, but they have done some executive orders, one of which I heard today was being challenged by a lawsuit, but the one that would prohibit new leases on federal land for fossil fuel extraction, that one's being challenged with a lawsuit, although it's been pointed out that there's so much that's already leased that isn't being developed because the price has been low, and there's just not demand for the additional hard to extract fuels. But that's one area that is currently being pursued, at least through executive order.
Mhm.
There's another thing that I'm interested about. See, in Columbia, has there been any study about any particular areas of the city that are particularly influenced by bad pollution or anything like that? It's not like we have a big coal plant downwind of our city at this time. Is there a study about who in Columbia is most affected by pollution and bad weather? No pollution.
Nikki, do you know the answer to that? I know we have like studies on like transportation pollution and whatnot, but who specifically is affected by that? I mean, I would guess lower income communities of neighborhoods of color would probably be the people who are most affected, because I mean, they're pretty strategically ignored, whether it is like from infrastructure to housing or whatnot. But Nikki, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that probably mostly low income neighborhoods, just because they're so underserved, particularly communities of color. They just don't have as many resources to bounce back. And so the impacts that they face are worsened and disproportionate to everyone else. But I don't know about specific studies necessarily.
Do they get cut off? Do the low income areas get cut off with electricity more than others? That kind of thing. Just trying to figure out, I know there's injustice, and just figure out how to articulate it for our city. And I should know this because I've lived here for a long time, but I'm afraid I don't.
One
Can I
thing
jump in? Oh, sorry, Mark.
just very briefly, it's not a pollution thing, but it's a flooding thing, that we have more of our low-income residents are living in low-lying areas. They're prone to flooding. And with climate change, there's more extreme weather events and more flooding going on. So that would be one area. We don't really have a congested urban core that has really bad air quality the way a bigger city might have. So I don't know if there's more pollution hitting low-income people necessarily, although I imagine somebody who lives 10 miles out of town on a big piece of land is going to have less air pollution than somebody who lives in the city.
Yeah, that helps. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in really quickly and say the Sierra Club, along with some other groups here in St. Louis City, we partnered locally with Washington University's environmental clinic, and we did community interviews with folks about what environmental issues they're seeing, and actually mapped it and created, a report about what's going on in the city, breaking it down by ward, zip code, etc. And because we're in the city and because of our close relationships our organizations have with helping Representative Cori Bush get elected, we talked to her more about these issues. She came to our community meetings about environmental racism, environmental injustices. And now her and Senator Markey from Massachusetts have introduced a federal piece of legislation to actually be able to map these environmental issues across the nation. So, hopefully this is a piece of legislation that starts moving, because then we could actually be able to break it down and do stuff like that. But I just wanted to highlight that because it's awesome that just like local work like that can just you know, those relationships are powerful of really connecting those issues and proving that it's in folks' best interest. Like, yeah, so hopefully down the road that data will be available, like more resounding, you know, is it illegal dumping? Is it vacancies?
Yeah.
Is it air pollution? Is it water pollution, lead contamination? You know, so many. So
That's a really cool point to make, Ashton, especially because I think a lot of people don't know the environmental injustices that go on like right in their backyards, especially like St. Louis. I mean, they have their fair share of environmental, not just environmental racism, but environmental injustices. So that's really cool. I didn't know about that. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, compliments? Anything you want to hear about next time? We can write down and make sure we cover.
Are you ever gonna give the, Erica, are you, the one you did before, on general climate change and all the challenges? Would you be giving that at another time? That was so excellent.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, I mean, we'd have to talk about it as Pieceworks, but I don't see why we wouldn't do it again. Especially since I've done it twice now. It's pretty, now I think I got it for where I don't have to, you know, prepare for weeks on end. So yeah, I think so. And I'd like to make it so I can record it because some of the videos and stuff are copyrighted by my gosh, climate reality leaders. I get Citizens Climate Lobby and Climate Reality Leaders confused every time.
You know,
Hi,
it's
Steve. Thank you for coming.
a real quick segue
Mhm.
from that last question. We have a Peaceworks steering committee, and it will be meeting on Monday evening, this coming Monday. And that's when we make decisions about things like when are we going to offer classes and what kind of events we're organizing, demonstrations, you know, things like our sustainable living fair. It's been going on last week and this week. So if anybody is local and interested, I don't think too many people who are on the screen right now are local, but those of you who are, would be most welcome to join us. We're probably going to be doing it by Zoom. We'd like to do it outdoors in person, but I think it's probably not going to be quite warm enough yet and light enough yet. But if you're interested, let me know. I'll send you all the info and a link to the Zoom.
Yeah, I highly recommend. That was one of my favorite things about Peaceworks is that, yeah, you can be on their steering committee without having like that much experience, or I don't know. It's just cool to be a part of decision making for an organization. And
I don't know if my father was on the steering committee, but he
Right.
was. He was. He
Yes.
was a big supporter. In fact, when he died, Peaceworks got his house, auctioned off his stuff, and you know he was, I think, tireless supporter and protester. He was down at the post office a lot, on TV and at the missile silos and other
Okay.
places. He was a missionary in India for 36 years and retired to Columbia, and Peaceworks became a big part of his life.
Mhm.
Very true.
Yeah, well, we'd love to have you, Max. Second generation Peaceworks supporter.
Now, Mark already wanted to know if I would be on the steering committee, but I probably am going to be moving.
Okay.
My son lives in Colorado, and my daughter, who lives in Tucson, is now moving to the town that my son lives. So they're both there, and that's probably where I'm going to end up.
Mhm.
Understandable.
Yeah, understandable.
There's work to do out there too, I bet you.
Yes, definitely.
Boy, my son's, the store that was shot up
Mhm.
just across the street from where he works, and that's where he goes to get coffee and things.
Oh my
Wow.
God.
I'm
There's
glad he's okay.
some things about the United States that really I hate.
Yes.
And our gun violence.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes. Enough said, for sure. Well, awesome. Nikki, do you have anything else to add, Ashton?
Well, coming every week.
Yeah, appreciate it. We lost, I don't know where Michael went, but I'm assuming he had internet issues. But yeah, so next week will be our last week until the next class. And yeah, like Nikki said, we'll have a bunch of organizations. So just come with your questions and concerns or compliments. It's my favorite thing now. Compliments.
Y'all did a great job. There you go.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I
you guys
appreciate
are
it.
really doing an awesome job.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
very much.
It's really good.
I know it's a lot of hard work. Appreciate it.
Well, I can't speak for Nikki, but I appreciate you all being here on a Wednesday night with us. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Especially for you folks in the Eastern time zone.
yeah, very much. Leslie, I don't know how you're not asleep right now, but I am thoroughly impressed. But
Couldn't tell.
yeah, well, awesome. Yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, I gave you all my email before, but yeah, just bring them next time and we can definitely address them. Cool. Thank you all.
Nice.
Guys, have a good night.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you.